revision lecture series by MP Siddhesh. This is the part 1 of the revision lecture on the directive principles of state policy. In this revision lecture, we shall cover the following. Firstly, introduction to the concept of directive principles, essential features of the directive principles of state policy, relationship of the directive principles with fundamental rights, and finally, a few important examples of the directive principles. We shall cover the judicial treatment or the case law surrounding the directive principles in the next video in this revision series on the DPSPs. The directive principles of state policy are the objectives to be achieved by the government. The concept of the DPSPs or the directive principles has been borrowed from the Irish Constitution. There is nothing similar to the DPSPs in the American Constitution. Therefore, DPSPs or the directive principles is one of the unique features of the Constitution of India. Now, let us look at what Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar had to say about the directive principles. According to Dr. Ambedkar, who was the father of the Indian Constitution, the government which gives effect to most of the directive principles shall be a popular and a stable government. Remember that. The government which gives effect to most of the DPSPs shall be a popular and a stable government according to Dr. Ambedkar. Let us take a look at some of the important features of the directive principles in this slide. First and foremost, the directive principles are non-enforceable. This means that the Supreme Court or the concerned High Court cannot issue writs for the enforcement of directive principles. Now, the topic of writs and the manner in which they are issued will be dealt with in the revision lecture pertaining to the powers of the Supreme Court. Next, Article 13 does not apply in the case of directive principles. This means that no law can be declared void under Article 13 only because it violates any of the directive principles. And lastly, the directive principles are not a source of legislative power or competence. Legislative competence is granted by Articles 245 and 246. We shall deal with legislative competence in detail in the revision lecture pertaining to the center-state relationship. For now, in the next slide, let us focus on the difference or the distinction between the fundamental rights and directive principles. In this slide, let us look at some of the differences between the directive principles and fundamental rights. Firstly, directive principles are positive obligations and, in contrast, fundamental rights are negative obligations. In very simple terms, the directive principles can be understood as the activities that shall be undertaken or the state shall undertake those activities. On the other hand, fundamental rights can be understood as the activities the state shall not do or shall not interfere with. Please take a moment to read the illustrative example provided in this slide for better understanding. Next, directive principles are made specifically non-enforceable by the virtue of Article 37, and on the other hand, fundamental rights are made enforceable by the courts like we saw previously. Last, it must be remembered that directive principles include social and economic rights, and in contrast, fundamental rights are civil and political rights. I am now confident that the difference between fundamental rights and the directive principles is clear to all of you. In the next slide, we shall look at some of the important examples of the directive principles. In this slide, we shall look at some of the important examples of the DPSPs or the directive principles. The directive principles are found in Articles 39 to 51 of the Indian Constitution. Some of the important examples of directive principles are: number 1, the right to livelihood under Article 39, Subclause A, promotion of the cooperative movement under Article 43B, enactment at some point of time of a uniform civil code which falls under Article 44, protection of the environment which falls under Article 48A, and protection of historical monuments which falls under Article 49. With this, we come to the end of part 1 of the revision lecture series on the directive principles. In part 2, we shall discuss the case law and the judicial treatment given to the directive principles or the DPSPs by the Supreme Court of India. I highly recommend watching both videos for a complete understanding of the topic. Thank you for watching. Please also watch part 2 for a complete understanding of this topic. Thank you once again.